Hello and welcome back to Watching Brief for the week of the 21st of November. Not October, as I apparently said last week. November 2022. I am joined as ever by my co-host, Mr. Andy Brockman. How are you doing, Andy? Up to much?
Well, if it was a normal World Cup, given there's a game on now, we wouldn't be recording. I'd actually be watching it. But given FIFA have so screwed everybody's thoughts on the beautiful game, I'm sort of rather indifferent at the moment, I'm afraid. And it's sort of partly ideological and partly don't reward the bastards.
Yeah,
you know.
Yeah. I mean, I don't particularly care about football or soccer at the best of times, but yeah, I can understand it. I mean, I feel bad for folks who would normally be watching. Is it Poland, Mexico who are playing at the moment as we're recording?
Currently, it is. Yeah, and it will be an interesting game as well.
Yeah. But no, I'm a fan of the egg-shaped ball game. Not American football though. Rugby, that is, of course.
Yes. American football, the game that's fought with, that's played with armour.
Well, this also oddly played
with, and lots of commercial breaks.
Lots of commercial breaks, but also oddly more than one team per team. You have an offensive team, you have a defensive team, you have a kicking line out as well. I find that fascinating. Anyway, regardless of which shape ball we prefer, our watching brief continues, and this week actually we're probably going to be publishing 2 watching briefs. This one could have come out over the weekend, but didn't. And we are going to be publishing it today. And that's an interview with the Save Our Sands campaign. But at the end of the week, we're probably going to be talking about Nottingham Castle. Things have got a wee bit messy down in Nottingham, or indeed up in Nottingham, depending on where you are in the country. And it may well be. I mean, we were joking how we've seen several canaries down the coal mine in recent months and years, but this may well be the pit pony down the coal mine who's now collapsed. So we'll come back to that at the end of the week. But today, Save Our Sands campaign have been celebrating a victory. At one point, actually, this victory looked fairly unlikely. At the very least, it was going to be very hard won. And we met up with the 2 head campaigners, the 2 campaign leads, for a chat, or at least you did, Andy.
That's right. Not long ago, we heard that the Save Our Sands campaign had been successful in that the Port of Dover withdrew its licence application to, as you'll hear, dredge a very large amount of the southwest Goodwin Sands, a very archaeologically and ecologically sensitive area off the coast of East Kent.
Yeah.
It's the 2 people concerned are Joe Thompson and Fiona Punter, who basically initiated and then drove the entire campaign for 6.5 years.
Mm-hmm.
And we wanted to catch up with them, partly because we've been following the story, and it's unusual in Watching Brief that we've got a story which has a beginning, a middle, and an end, but also, or at least an end before the sequel.
Yes,
as they allude to at the end of our conversation.
Yeah.
But also because I think there are observations to be made and lessons to be drawn which are relevant across the archaeology and heritage sector. So this is the conversation we recorded with them earlier. Welcome to the Watching Brief, Joanna Thompson and Fiona Punter, and thank you for joining us to talk about the Save Our Sands campaign. Now, as we sit here on a Tuesday afternoon in November 2022, you must be 2 of the leading lay experts on tidal wave modelling in the English Channel, historic shipwrecks on the Goodwin Sands, and the ecology of sand eels. How do you feel you've come to that position? Where were you when the Save Our Sands campaign actually started?
I can remember the moment vividly. I was standing in my dining room, and my son Will came in and just said, they're going to dredge the Goodwins. And I just went, they can't. And I think that's what one normal reaction is. You can't do something. And as you said in your blog, that's actually not good enough. You have to get on and get all the expert advice in. But I can just remember thinking they just can't do it. I don't know what I was doing at the time. And I just sort of joined the campaign. And as more and more people dropped out, sort of got more and more involved.
It was a neighbour of mine. We were having a drink, and he said, "Have you heard? They're going to dredge the Goodwins." And like Joe, I went, "They can't do that." I was quite aware of the wartime heritage of the Goodwins, and much less so in those days about the environment and ecology, which I've had to learn about over the last 6.5 years. But I thought, I can't. They can't do that. And then there was a collection going to help fund the campaign. I remember rattling down the road with 20 quid and putting it in an envelope. And about a month or so later, there was a call out for people to come and help. And I thought, well, I can do that. I've had a media and marketing background. I don't scare easily, and I'll join. And like Joe, the numbers became smaller and smaller as each week passed. And by the end of that October, from the summer to October, more or less, it was just Joe and I. But with the proviso, we've always had fantastic expert support from the very beginning. But it was Joe and I at the tough end, the hard, pointy end the whole time.
The involvement of independent experts, I think, is one of the things that certainly struck me. I've been covering the story. In fact, I was aware of it before I started covering the story sort of journalistically for the Pipeline blog and for Watching Brief, and working sometimes with other colleagues. And cards on the table for our viewer, my family actually come from East Kent. I grew up a few miles from the coast, and the first I heard of the campaign to save the Goodwins was actually at a family get together when my cousin, who still lived in the Deal area, mentioned it. And my first instinct as an archaeologist was, wait a minute, this is serious. But other parts of the sector seem to have been quite slow to respond, and have been somewhat, on occasions at least, and again, not entirely, but on occasions, somewhat diffident in engaging with the issue. Did you, when you started looking for those independent experts to advise you, and to question the data that Port of Dover was putting up, and to remind people, the plan was to dredge with a commercial dredger well over 1 million tons of sand and gravel aggregate for the Dover Western Docks Revival project in Dover Harbour, Britain's busiest ferry port. But did you find it easy to recruit those experts that you'd identified that you needed?
Well, I think Fiona did the first one. She found the Nautical Archaeology Society, and I can't remember how she did that. She'll have to tell you herself. But through them, I don't know, are we allowed to mention names or not names?
If they're on the public record, then yes. Otherwise, obviously, if it was on background, then...
Well, the secretary of the Nautical Archaeology Society has been absolutely amazing. And without him, we would not have got anywhere, because he had done so much of all this before. And also the Joint Nautical Archaeology Policy Committee, I think Fiona found them as well, actually. The chairman there they were helpful as well, but it was the secretary who really on a day-to-day basis was there for us. You could ring him up any time of night and he'd tell us what to do, or he told us what to do, who to contact, how to write things, told us if we were going to be libelous and said, no, you can't say things like that.
I suppose in many ways I was lucky. I've had a background of having to research stuff. I did a lot of work with military and government, so deep web searching is not alien to me. And so I just hit the web. I put mad things in like archaeology, Navy, Ministry of Defence. I contacted people that I knew, ex-MOD, and a variety of others, and eventually names came up, organisation names came up. And we all know you start with a seed and then that grows, you get all the little roots coming off it. And that's more or less how it started. But I remember ringing the NAS, and the person I spoke to initially said, I'm just off. I'm literally got a car waiting. I'm going on research and I'm going to be gone for several weeks. And I thought, no, I've only just found you. And then he passed us on to the secretary, which was an immense help. But some people have been absolutely incredible. And help has come from areas which we wouldn't necessarily have expected initially. And areas where we would have liked help from, we didn't get. Some parts of the overall mix of the Goodwins, the challenge of the Goodwins, it's been quite hard to get people. But when we did find them, digging deep, for want of a better word. They have all come forward and been marvellous.
I'll come back to that maybe a little bit later. But one of the first things that struck me about your entire campaign is that here you are, you're two professional women, you've got your own backgrounds and expertise and so on, but you're coming up against this large industry, which, and again, just to put our view in the picture, the Goodwin Sands, it's roughly 8 miles off the coast of East Kent. It's a huge sand and gravel bar over chalk, which sits in the English Channel. It's ecologically and archaeologically sensitive. That's been recognised for a long time. And the Port of Dover, to try and access that sand and gravel, had to submit a licensing application to what's called the Marine Management Organisation, the MMO. That's the government body that administers basically Britain's territorial waters and exclusive economic zone, where Britain exercises rights over the exploitation of offshore aggregates, as we got in this case, oil, gas, building wind turbine farms, and so on. So you're suddenly pitching yourself into a bureaucratic process which has many component parts, many moving component parts, and where a very large organisation, the Port of Dover, with a multi-million-pound budgets, is submitting an application backed up by a significant international consultant, Royal Haskoningsh, who are coordinating the license application, the ecological aspects of the license application for Port of Dover. Did you feel daunted by that prospect when you first started to assess what you were actually up against and what you had to do to achieve to make your point?
It might have been ignorance is bliss, but no, we weren't daunted. And I think what really got us going was, if you only remember, we went to they had a presentation in Discovery Park. So it was Sandwich. It was in the middle of nowhere. It was at 4:00 in the afternoon on a weekday afternoon. And they spent, I don't know how much money on this presentation, and that Royal Haskoningsh came to it and Wessex Archaeology came to it, extolling the virtues of dredging the Goodwins and why it wasn't going to harm anything, anywhere, anytime. And it was just such a load of BALLS that it just made us so mad that we just felt that we are not going to let them get away with this, because they were so blatantly telling lies. And I can remember one particular thing. I know Fiona remembers it too. Wessex were giving a diagram of they were going to cut at the edge of the sandbank and they were going to dredge along the side and leave this cliff of sand hanging. And I remember saying, well, surely that cliff is just going to collapse into the sea. Ah, yes, but that's not as a result of the dredging. And you just thought, who are these people? So
right. Fiona, same question. What was how did you feel once you sort of, as you do, going into something like this, you risk assess what might happen? What did you come up with?
Well, for me, it was they were trying to sell us their knowledge and their expertise and their wisdom, and they failed absolutely from the get-go. The holes that we could see in their argument, even in those very early days, we picked up enough to be able to see right through it. And they couldn't actually answer questions we put forward then. It was all a question of and I'm sitting there thinking, this is absolute tosh. And as Joe said, they stuck in the middle of the afternoon, somewhere where there was no access to public transport. And it was a very deliberate move to try to make sure that they got their people there, Port of Dover and everybody else, but we didn't get the people there. But those that mattered did arrive, and everyone felt it was a very thin, shabby presentation. From that on, as Joe says, we got angry and we wanted to get even.
No, I have to say at this point that I'm sure the Port of Dover and Royal Haskoningsh would say that they behaved perfectly appropriately within the rules of the planning system, and that what they were doing was community engagement with the with stakeholders. But having said that, I think the first, again, talking as a story that I've followed, and Marc and I have followed personally on the watching brief. I just quoting from a document from July 2016, which I think was probably the first real red flag for me, in terms of there was something going wrong with the process. Was the response to the Marine Management Organisation to the Royal Haskelling's submission on behalf of the Port of Dover. It was the response from Historic England, and the first paragraph of the summary is absolutely brutal. It says, "We must advise you," this is the Marine Management Organisation, "we must advise the Marine Management Organisation that we are not satisfied by the information presented in this marine licence application as referenced above." That's Port of Dover and Royal Haskelling's. "And we must recommend that you do not grant consent for this development as presently submitted." Now, I can't remember many occasions when Historic England have been that outspoken on a development issue, because apart from anything else, their remit from government is to support sustainable development. So first of all, how did you react when you started seeing responses like that coming in from regulators within the heritage sector in particular? But obviously also we were seeing the same similar things from the natural environment sector.
Well, actually, we didn't see it as a real support of our cause. There seemed to be caveats to it. You know, you read that initial phrase, and then there were caveats to it. So it wasn't. It says, if you change this, it says, well, yeah, okay, we don't like it, but if you change this and if you change that, then we'll agree. And this is what happened all the way through the 3 public consultations, is that they started off saying, yeah, we don't like it. And then they made it possible for it to, they were making it possible for it to happen. So we saw through that quite quickly. And then actually, we were completely shocked when after the 3rd public consultation, and they were still saying, we don't like it, but, you know, you still got more questions to answer. Fiona, I don't know if you can remember this, but I think last public consultation was in about December 2017, I think. And then suddenly in February 2018, completely out of the blue, they just said, yeah, that's absolutely fine, go ahead. Just 3 months later, and we don't know what happened, whose arm was twisted or what conversation was had. Yeah, they just suddenly just gave in. They just completely caved in and said, yeah, it's absolutely fine. And the archaeology had not been protected properly. The agreements had not been put in place at that stage at all. Well, they still hadn't even 2 months ago.
What shocked me and surprised me was the linearity, that it seemed to be very much a box-ticking exercise, that it was all quantitative. And there was very little room for, you know, the feel, the qualitative side of it. I have lost complete faith in the quangos, for want of a better word. I was really surprised at what amounts to refusal to listen. Anything they didn't like, they buried or lost. What a bit of losing things went on. So in a nutshell, I was shocked, really shocked. Not in the bureaucracy. I fully expected bureaucracy. Crikey, anyone who pays tax understands bureaucracy. But it was just the rest of it. It was like, whoa, all you're there to do is tick this box, tick that one, tick the next one. And if all those are done, then it'll go through. That was it. And that's when we felt we really had to step up.
And if I could add to that, actually, Fiona's made some really good points there. It soon became very clear that the Marine Management Organisation itself has no actual knowledge, and it relies completely on the recommendations or not of its stakeholders. So mostly the Environment Agency, Historic England, and Natural England, and CFAS. And it just goes by what they say. It doesn't sit back and say, well, actually, is what they're saying correct? Does it make sense? Is it realistic? You know, just the very fact that removing, it's actually 3 million tons, Andy, not 1. I'm sorry to have to correct you on that.
No, you're right. It started off as 3 million. I think they cut it back by the end of the submission, hadn't they? Yeah.
But the surveys were done on the basis of it being 3 million tons.
Yes, sorry. Yes, you're right.
Yeah, and for the Environment Agency to say, to be using very old data to start with, but then to say there'll be no impact on our very vulnerable East Kent coast by removing 3 million tonnes. It was just mind-boggling, and it was just, as Fiona said, we just lost complete confidence because they didn't ask any questions. They just ticked the boxes, as Fiona says. They didn't ask questions. They didn't probe anybody and say, they just accepted whatever was said at face value. Mm-hmm. And in fact, I don't know if this is the right time to say it, but we found, and I wish we'd found it in 6 years ago, 2 years ago, I actually read one of a 2008 study by Wallingford's. I actually read it. I should have read it 4 or 5 years ago. And it was mind-blowingly, it was just a revelation because it showed the inadequacy of the studies that had been done for part of the coastal impact assessment. Basically, the data was not fit for purpose. They only analysed removing 250,000 tonnes as opposed to 3 million tonnes. And the Environment Agency just accepted that and said that's absolutely fine. And because they accepted it, then the MMO accepted it. And in fact, we think this might have led to the demise of the licence because actually we found what we believe to be so many flaws in it that we actually flagged them up. Nobody would listen apart from our MP, and she was fully on board all over the summer. And she was getting to people about this because you'll talk about it later, but you were talking about other projects, what substandard surveying is going on. And I think there's probably quite a lot. And,
again, maybe we'll come back to that. The MP, again, just for if people aren't familiar, the MP you're talking about is Natalie Elphick, isn't it? The Conservative MP for Dover.
Yeah, she's been fantastic. A real support to us. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, again, I think one of the red flags for the independent archaeology community, certainly for me, we're talking here about, picking up your point about the way that the MMO interacted with stakeholders and expert bodies and outside experts, was the way that the consultant Royal Haskoning approach the issue of ships and aircraft, particularly aircraft from World War II, which are known to have come down on and around the Goodwin sands, are absolutely legally protected by the Protection of Military Remains Act 1986, which means that you can't even touch one without a license agreed in advance with a department of the Ministry of Defence called the Joint Casualty and Compassionate Centre, JCCC. And licenses aren't normally granted if there are believed to be the remains of aircrew or munitions still aboard the relevant aircraft. And yet, Royal Haskoning in their original submission didn't mention that at all. And in fact, as I understand it, when it was pointed out by the campaign that the Protection of Military Remains Act applied, there were some fairly rapid and probably rather embarrassed red-faced meetings in the Ministry of Defence, including, I understand, with the representatives of the German government, as well as Luftwaffe aircraft are also included. What do you think the handling of that issue tells you or tells us about the way that the consultants were approaching the application?
Well, we know for a fact that Royal Haskoning and Wessex had worked together on the Thames estuary, the Thames Gateway dredging. They knew absolutely all about JCCC because they had to go through that process with them. So we have no idea why they chose to ignore it on this occasion. I do know that when Dover Harbord first sent out their questionnaire to all the sort of local little stakeholders, it was actually quite appalling the amount of apathy, as public, the apathy of all these little companies or organisations. Very few of them bothered to reply or respond. And of course, if people don't respond, you just assume, well, they're not bothered, they don't care about it. But they wrote to the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, who didn't bother to respond because it's outside their jurisdiction, as you said in your blog. But why Haskoning and Wessex didn't flag it up, I don't know. And maybe Fiona's got some other thoughts on this.
I can't find a rationale for it. Part of it goes back to the original, to Tim Waggett, who from the off was about, well, we can do it because we've done it before. And it almost seemed like they were going to do very cursory work, very thin work.
Can I just interrupt for a second just to explain that Tim Waggett, at the time the application was first submitted, was the chief executive of Dover Harbour Board, the Port of Dover. I've got another question to ask you about his approach to the thing in a moment. But Fiona, just to clarify who we're actually talking about here.
Well, Joe went to a meeting. I wasn't at that one, but he basically told her, well, we can do it because we've done it before. And that's a bit red rag to a bull for Joe and I. And that seemed to colour everything that was done by all the consultants. We think they paid a small amount of money, get it all done right, tick a few boxes, and it'll sail through. They never expected to have the objections that we put, the objections and the campaign that we fought. Interestingly, we wrote to many former and current senior MOD people, officials and representatives of the services. And I was staggered at how many people think, and military people think, that the Commonwealth War Graves Commission has jurisdiction out at sea. And it's quite difficult actually to put people like the late Lord Boyce, have to correct them. That was a bit of a challenge in itself. Many, the associations, were extremely helpful behind the scenes. They're not allowed to help us officially because that's against their remit. But as individuals and the ex-M and ex-sailors, they came forward and embraced what we were trying to do. But in terms of why the consultants didn't look at it, as I say, I think it was, let's get this survey work done, let's do it on the cheap, get it through, and we're home and dry. Not to be.
I have looked at this and have suggested to myself that I can ask a question, I think, legitimately here. Do you think there was either a conscious or unconscious bias to simply deliver for the client and remove obstacles?
Oh, we've been told that all the way along, that it's a very small circle of expertise. There's very few companies like Royal Haskoning and Wessex who actually do these EIAs, to put them together. If they put obstacles in the way of the client, they're not going to get any work. So they have got to make it. They've got to make it work, basically. But I mean, doing that out in the Goodwins and saying there's no aircraft or shipwrecks in the dredge zone when there clearly are, I mean, it must be so dangerous for the contractors, because, I mean, Dover would have gone back to them. The first time they dredged up something or they would have hit two aircraft and a steam boiler that wrecked that we know about, that those are just that we found, that our divers found. I mean, as soon as they get hit and, and all the dredging stops, I mean, surely Dover would have said to them, what's going on? Why didn't you know these were here? Why didn't you tell us about them? I mean, it's very short-sighted. I think it's a very short-sighted way of operating.
Actually, just a sort of quick supplementary there. You mentioned local divers. You, again, engaged with the local fishing community, the local divers, the people who knew and work and dive and see the Goodwins spring, winter, summer, autumn regularly. Which, again, the consultants appear not to have done. And you got information that the consultants didn't have. So, again, how do you feel about that?
Pretty good, actually. I mean, it took a long time. The divers are a very suspicious lot. Very suspicious lot.
Yeah.
And in fact, Fiona tried on numerous occasions to contact the various dive clubs, and we got absolutely nowhere. And it actually wasn't until after the license was granted that a diver came. I was away on holiday in Scotland. I can remember I was on the Isle of Mull, and I suddenly got these texts saying, I know where their aircraft crash sites in the dredge zone. And we just went, bloody hell, why don't you tell us? And he said, I'm only telling you now because they're at threat of being dredged up. And he wouldn't tell us before. And then and then he's told us about other shipwrecks, and then there's other divers who are talking to our consultants but don't talk to us, but we know that they're discussing between them what is on the sands. They're very, very secretive, and nobody wants to share their secrets at all, which is quite frustrating.
Trying to, as Joe said, trying to extract information from various groups was a challenge. But I think everyone realised that we were trying to look after the Goodwins. We're trying to protect things. We weren't doing it for our own glory or anything. And slowly but surely, information started to come through. More people got in contact with us, and we got more support. Even though the license had been granted by then, we never knew what would come up. You've got to talk to absolutely everybody you possibly can. Oh my goodness, we now know about whelk fishing and whelk farming on the Goodwins too. All sorts of different things that we've learned during the last 6.5 years. But you have to talk to everybody, and only through that have we actually ultimately managed to get where we are today.
I'd like to take a moment to ask you really about the personal pressures of running a campaign like the one that you did over the Goodwin Sands, and particularly the first half of the campaign. You were dealing with Tim Wagott, who was the then chief executive of the Port of Dover, and had a reputation of being, shall we say, an assertive manager. And at one stage, the Port of Dover started to play almost play the people, not the ball, in that there was a website set up. You were accused of trying to do down the people of Dover, to prevent them taking on jobs, prevent them attracting new investment. And horror of horrors, you were from Deal, not from Dover. So therefore, what right did you have to engage with the engage with this multi-million-pound project? And you were a bunch of amateurs anyway. It started to get quite personal, quite nasty. What did you think when that started to happen, and how did you cope with it as individuals?
We thought we're getting to him. We were delighted. He was taking us seriously. It was ridiculous. He took out a whole page advert in the local paper, Deliver for Dover. And, it was, as you say, we were costing Dover its jobs, which we knew was complete rubbish, because actually it was, if I'm right, Fiona, I think it's something like 400 jobs over 15 years. So it wasn't, a huge amount of jobs. And in the event, there was such a dreadful collapse of the ferries, with Brexit and COVID, that actually far more jobs have got lost because of all the things that have happened in the last 2 years. So his fears were unfounded, really. I remember going to France on a day trip and seeing this Deliver for Dover campaign coming up on the screen at the ferry port, and had to take a photograph of it. And I was dead chuffed. I thought, we're really getting to them. But it wasn't actually him we dealt with. It was the Marine Management Organisation. He was just there in the background. I only came across him the once. When he at the very beginning, when he said to me with this very smug smile, and I said, well, why are you doing it? Because we did it before, very smugly. I just thought, oh, you nasty little man. Fiona, have you got any more comments on him?
Well, on what they did, we heard 3 separate times. I have to say this is totally unsubstantiated, but it was interesting. It came from 3 disparate individuals who have nothing to do with each other, who contacted us all personally on the QT to say that the port police were investigating Joe and I. Now,
what? Following us, and that we were being reviewed. What? We were under surveillance.
And it was 3 completely random people. And I thought, my goodness gracious me, what is it? This Tim Waggott's got his own private police force? Really? So then I had to do some beavering around about legalities and things like that. We'll never know whether that was true or not. But I said, Joe and I do go to France, and we think, oh, we're going to get stopped at the port. We're going to be arrested as undesirables. We have no idea. They're all very peculiar, very, very strange. And they did actually at one stage put up banners in the high street attacking the group from Deal. But thankfully, we do have supporters in Dover, and they photographed and got back to us immediately. And in fact, I think the banners went down within the day. They stopped because it's getting hostility. So that misjudged again. They didn't understand really what they were doing and how to do it properly. Well,
in fact, to add to that, as Fiona's reminded me of something. So we had we were given opportunity to present to all the local councils, because the Dover Harbour Board were going around all the different councils giving a little presentation about why, you know, dredging the Goodwins was a good thing. And the councils, in all fairness, invited us to come along at the same time and you know, tell our side of the story. And we went to Dover, and the chairman of the Dover Council was a close friend of Dover Harbour Board, and he was obviously didn't like anything that we had to say. But at the end of the evening, they had a vote. They decided to vote whether to support. Am I right, Fiona? Was it to support the dredging? Was there a consultation or something? I can't remember what they voted on. But anyway, the unanimous decision was they voted against the Harbour Board because of the publicity campaign. They said it was completely out of order. It was not the right way to go about things, and they had no faith in what they were doing. And they voted to support us, which was fantastic, you know, and it just completely backfired on them, on Dover Harbour Board.
Yeah, and Dover Harbour Board then walked out of the meeting, which wasn't terribly grown up. It's not what you do. You sit there and take it on the chin.
Now, in the course of all this, Mr. Waggett left the Port of Dover to pursue other opportunities 2 weeks after, I think, a HR consultant's report into his behaviour with members of staff, members of the public, landed with the board of the Port of Dover. And he was succeeded by a man called Doug Bannister. Did you sense a change of regime, change of approach when under the new leadership at Dover, at the Port of Dover?
Sadly not. We hoped there would be, and we wrote to Mr. Bannister at very early days. I can't remember what we said, but basically saying yes, you know, change of regime, change of tune. And if I'm right, Fiona, he just wrote back saying no. You know, I'll just keep going. We'll just keep on going the way we're going. So that was a bit of a disappointment. I mean, the only positive thing we had was that the manager in charge of the port development is a dinghy sailor, and he joined our sailing club where I'm the treasurer. And I remember all the members got very worried that he and I were going to have a go at each other on the beach when we were launching our dinghies. And actually he was a really nice chap, and we got on quite well, and we're still in communication. Actually, I forgot to tell Fiona, I had a nice email from him the other day. And he was very professional, and he knew exactly where we were coming from. And so that was the sort of good relationship we had with him, and I could ask him certain things and he'd either tell me the answer or he wouldn't. And in fact, he was the one who gave me access to the 2008 study, just like that we hadn't found before. He sent it to me early days.
So there have been these pretty much unprecedented 3 separate consultations with the Marine Management Organisation, where your campaign is raising more and more questions. Other people are pitching in. Nautical Archaeology Society, independent experts are questioning the. Our particular interest, obviously, is in the archaeology aspects of the campaign and of the application and how they were treated. But eventually, the Marine Management Organisation grants Dover its licence. There've been adjustments. There've been certain protocols have been put in, but I think it's fair to say you as the campaign don't feel they're acceptable and fit for purpose. And you really take the only formal step that you've got left to you, which is to seek a judicial review on grounds that the licence hasn't been granted lawfully. Now that's a high risk activity, a high risk strategy. It's also very expensive. So what kind of decision making process did you go through as a campaign and as individuals? Because again, a JR has to be brought by an individual, not by an organisation. So how did you approach that, and how did you approach funding it?
Well, I volunteered to be the name on it, because I felt, well, if I couldn't do it, I couldn't ask anybody else to do it. We engaged Richard Buxton, Environmental and Public Law in Cambridge. We came to an agreement over the fees, which we felt was manageable. And then we just started crowdfunding, and he suggested crowd justice because the money goes straight to crowd justice and then straight to the lawyer. It doesn't get sidetracked anywhere else. And we mounted a crowd justice campaign. I remember I think we raised £2,000 on the first day and thought that was fantastic. And then it took a long time to get up. I think we raised about 30 grand in the end, which didn't go anywhere near covering the fees, but they've all been sorted and written off, and a lot of people did a lot of pro bono work for us. But if I remember rightly, I don't know what the phrase, we sought a judicial review. We were refused the first time, weren't we, Fiona? And we reckoned the chap hadn't even read the document. The judge hadn't even read the document properly.
No, we hadn't.
His comments were just off the wall completely. So we then appealed that, and then we got granted a permission hearing, and we had Justine. I can't remember. She's a lady QC. She literally just come to the bench the week before. Can you remember her name, Fiona? I can't remember her name.
Wasn't she David Miliband, one of the Miliband's wives?
Yes. Justine Hole. Oh, I can't remember. Sorry, I forgotten her name.
To interject there, we're talking about the Honourable Mrs. Justine Thornton was
that's it. Yes, well done.
Was the judge who oversaw the the judicial review.
And she granted. So we appealed on two grounds. One was an environmental ground, and the second was an archaeological ground. And she granted the permission hearing. No, she granted us the judicial review on the environmental ground, which actually slightly shocked us because it was quite a weak argument. And it was one that the QCs had put in as an alternative because we felt the archaeology one was the strongest point. And we lost on that, although she did say we did have to have a consultation on the archaeological written scheme of investigation, which we never got around to doing. And then, so the actual judicial review went on the environmental ground, which, we knew we had very little oomph in it, and it didn't have any oomph in it. Natural England completely swayed the day. But what was so ridiculous about the whole thing is that a week before the license was granted, the whole area was designated a marine conservation zone. The sand they were targeting for taking out was a protected habitat within the marine conservation zone. I mean, it was just such a nonsense. And that was another reason why we weren't prepared to give up. It was just so ridiculously unrealistic. Everyone talking about paper parks. Well, it could not have been truer.
Just staying with judicial review just for a second and the outcome of it. It's often said that it's a really grueling process, and that you, as an appellant in a judicial review, are generally speaking up against an opponent who's got very deep pockets and is prepared to game it out for as long as they possibly can and try and basically force you to retract, forget it. Did you get any sense that was going on?
Well, the opponent was the Marine Management Organisation. And I hadn't appreciated what we would have to do for judicial review. I thought, okay, you get your lawyers, get your barrister. No, Joe wading through piles and piles of paper, almost books that we'd created and put together, this massive boot full of information being driven up to Cambridge to the solicitors. It's a car boot full. I've never seen so many boxes. And I hadn't realised how much would come down to us because we didn't have that technical knowledge. As Joe said before, but it was effectively, especially in terms of environment, more or less the two of us with a little bit of help on specific environmental issues, very specific environmental issues. There we were in front of this justice, this argument going on, and it was so dry and so tough, and it was a point of a legal point. It's not what I had understood, but it was a learning curve, and it was a fascinating process to go through. Would we do it again? Yes, we'd do it again, but we'd do it again with the benefit of an awful lot more hindsight. And I can understand how people get dissuaded from going through the process, but you've got to throw at these things everything you possibly can. If you don't believe in it to take it to the end, then there's no point.
Just slightly to add to that, I mean, we had been advised by other campaigners that the MMO had always backed down at the last minute, and that was something else that kept us going. And unfortunately, they didn't back down at the last minute on this one.
No. So we get to the point, and we can start to move towards the end game here now. I think we get to the point where you've lost the judicial review. Port of Dover is still planning to remove that material from the Southwest Goodwins. Many of the archaeological questions are still outstanding because they've been put on the back burner to be decided when the project's about to go ahead. What made you carry on, and what questions did you think you still had that could actually impact on what Dover was wanting to do?
Well, actually, what made
Jo.
us carry on was Dover Harbour Board instigating a group of their consultants called G.I.G.O, Goodwin Sands Advisory Group. And they said we couldn't be on it because we didn't know anything. We were unintelligent and uninformed and inexperienced, more or less, but we could have a representative on it. So we had the best magnetometer survey representative on it that we knew of, who'd been helping us all the way along. And he was absolutely fantastic, actually. And he actually ended up knowing more about the archaeology and how to miss or hit archaeology than Wessex or Royal Haskoning. And in fact, at one point, Dover wanted to employ him as a consultant, which got sharp shift from us. But we knew that he wouldn't switch sides. So we were still very much involved in the decision process. Nothing was going to go ahead or get past us because this guy was on the case.
What was going on in the background to all this? We'd always been told from the very beginning that you delay, you push it, stretch it out as much as possible. And with the 3 public consultations, the judicial review, on the background of that, then you had Brexit, then you had COVID, then we had the Dover's new marina, which was had supervision from the same people who had said there'd be no impact on the East Kent foreshore. And the marina development's been a disaster because it didn't take into account wave modelling, properly wave modelled. That we knew as long as we.
Okay, actually, can I just insert there briefly, just to explain that the part of the Dover Western Docks revival plan was a new yachting marina, which was meant to be a generator. It was meant to generate a sort of cultural and restaurant quarter, wasn't it, in Dover Harbour, as all the yachties arrived to anchor for the weekend and use the local restaurants and visit the local facilities and so on. And in fact, the design was so misconceived that the entrance was actually dangerous for yachts to enter, if I'm correct.
Not just the entrance, it was inside the marina. There was an unexpected swell in anything more than a force 4 with a southwesterly wind, which any yachty in Dover told them before this all started. Any yachties would say, that part of the harbour is horrible in a wind. And apparently even in the Second World War, the Royal Navy wouldn't moor up in that part of the harbour because of the swell. So why, again, they thought they knew better. Goodness knows what went on there, but they have been proven. The only people who go in there at the moment are Border Force. The lifeboats, I think, have just moved in there. Fiona might know more than I, but it's been empty. It was empty for 3 years. They eventually built a little sort of a wave wall at the entrance, and that hasn't helped. And now they've got permission to build another 80-metre long wall at an angle across the entrance.
You couldn't make it up. You can't make this up. I mean, they had to have a harbour revision order, for heaven's sake. But so that was the background to everything. So we've got the guy on the committee. You've got all this in the background. It is being delayed, and it was getting, of course, very close to the fact that the licence was going to expire, and we're just hanging on in there the whole time, seeing what would happen.
So to bring it up to date. The license was granted, but it was due to expire at the end of December this year, as I understand it. And a few weeks ago, the Port of Dover issued a press release over the signature of Doug Bannister, the CEO, and they said, I'm quoting from part of Mr. Bannister's text, they said that they were going to withdraw the plan to dredge from the Goodwins. They maintained that it was still a good plan, but they weren't going to carry it through any longer. And then they concluded, or Mr. Bannister's press release concluded, this is a win for us all. It enables us to move forward with confidence in developing land for new local employment opportunities at a time when such opportunities are greatly needed, and helps unify our community by removing an issue that has, in places, divided opinion. How did you react? Well, first of all, how much warning, or if any, did you have that press release was coming out? And then how did you react when you actually read the text?
Fiona found out first. I can't remember what I was doing, but I was out of phone contact.
You were swimming.
I was swimming in the sea. That's right. I'd gone for a wonderful swim. It was the most beautiful day. It was the 14th of October, and it was lovely then. And I got back. That's right. And Fiona was ringing me. I said, "Oh, for God's sake, just leave me alone. I just want to go swimming." And then she rang my son, and I thought, God, something's gone on. And then I saw a missed mobile phone number on my phone, and I just rang it. I didn't know who it was, and it was Natalie Elphick at the other end. And
that's the MP.
That's the MP, yeah.
Yeah.
And she says, I think I've got some news for you. And I sat down. I said, do I need to sit down? And she said, yes. And I said, is it the news that I'm hoping for? And she said, yes. And I think I let out the most enormous scream. Poor girl, she must have been deafened. And then she had obviously heard the press release before we did, or got hold of it before we did. And it was, and because I think she'd been working behind the scenes. I think she's quite instrumental in I mean, we haven't asked her yet, but what happened? But we think she's quite instrumental in negotiating. She knew about the study that we'd found. We believed all the flaws in the data and the surveys, and we were going to bring those out in the open. And she was right behind us for doing that.
Well, in fact, at the same time, she was quoted as saying, and I think we can perhaps see some bridge building going on here, which you were talking about working behind the scenes. In response to the Port of Dover decision, Natalie Elphick said, quote, it's an excellent outcome, and I pay tribute to the work of the Port of Dover in finding the solution, and to the Goodwin Sands SOS team for raising this important issue. Do you get what sense do you get from the way this has been framed?
Well, it's I mean, we quite understood. She wanted we all wanted the Port of Dover to develop. I mean, I lived in Dover 20 years ago. I taught at one of the schools there, and it has not improved in 20 years. It has not moved economically. Has not moved on. So it needs all the help it can get. It just didn't need to use the Goodwins to get there. And this is what the previous MP, he just could not get that. And it was actually so simple. All you have to do is say to these developers, yeah, I fully support what you're doing, but I don't support where you're getting it from. There's dredging sites 15 miles out in the channel. It's not going to cost you that much more to go and get it from there. And that's all that needed to be said six years ago. And I'm sure that's what Natalie said to them in the end. I don't know. I mean, you probably agree.
Well, they having, with all the issues with HGVs coming into Kent, the roadblocks, the problems, logistical problems. They had to get to a solution. They had to sort something out. And Natalie was only too well aware that we would, if they'd reapplied for the licence, there would have been another public consultation. We would have taken it, and it would have been delayed, and we would have fought. And it was going to take too long. They'd already expected to be building when they're doing it within a year of applying for the licence, and just that didn't happen. So the delay has been absolutely immense. And it was when Natalie called me, I was in a pub car park in Chichester. My poor husband says, what's the noise? There's me shrieking and all the rest. And it was the initial reaction, but I still can't quite believe it. But as Joe and I know only too well, it's a battle won, as we've been saying. It's not necessarily the war, because there are other interested parties. And it is viewed, the Goodwins are viewed as a resource zone. And we have to now, longer term, challenge that perception and get a level of understanding. People realise that this is actually culturally, ecologically, environmentally, historically, incredibly, and archaeologically, incredibly important to our nation.
And just to finish on that, and actually looking forward, we've spent this conversation looking back over 6.5 years and the journey that you've taken and your campaign has taken over that time. But looking forward, there's a new organisation, the Goodwin Sands Conservation Trust, which I understand you've been involved with. Can you explain what it is and what it hopes to achieve?
We started the trust in 2018 as a charity, as Fiona said, because we realised that actually this wouldn't be the last dredging application for the Goodwins. The good deal is here because of the Goodwins, because they created the Downs, which is the area of calm water between the sandbank and the shore. And the height of our naval sailing, the maritime history. I mean, the Downs was hundreds of ships were moored out there, and so they were all being serviced by Deal. And now they've all disappeared, and the masts, from the sunken ships have all disappeared. They are slightly out of sight, is out of mind. But as Fiona said, they are incredibly important to our nation still. And so we wanted to bring this back into people's consciousness. And the only way to do it is to try and tell their story. And we've been doing that for the last couple of years now. Once COVID was over, we could get out to the markets and we could do pop-up displays. We just had a really successful art exhibition in a lovely gallery in Deal High Street. We've had storyboards printed and displayed artifacts that have been dredged up, or not dredged up, no, that's the wrong word, brought up from the sand, and together with local artists who all did artwork about the sands. And that was incredibly popular and had a lot of positive feedback. And in fact, we've now been asked to put the storyboards in Deal Museum, Dover Museum, Ramsgate Museum. We're going to have to get them all printed to go round. And then our next project is to get activity sheets into the primary schools, because we just want everyone to the Goodwins to reawaken in everybody's consciousness, because they're fascinating. There's just so much information out there. There's a wonderful place, and there's just so much to learn about them.
And one final question. Looking back over that 6.5 years, you have used every tool in the toolbox, I think, in terms of environmental campaigning. And if you didn't know the tools were there at the beginning, or even that the toolbox was there, you've learnt how to use it and used it, I think most people would accept, pretty effectively. But the obvious question, having been through it now, if you were faced with this situation again, would you go through this all over again? And secondly, would you advise, what would you say to anybody seeing a situation that they're concerned about, as you were concerned about the Goodwins, how to approach trying to persuade people, maybe powerful people, maybe people with deep pockets, as I said earlier, how to approach trying to combat a situation like that?
Well, you've got to get the professionals on board. You've got to find people who know what they're talking about, so that you can talk in an informed way. That was key. When it comes to public consultations, it's not good enough to say, I don't like this. You've got to say why you don't like it and why it's potentially not legal, or what flaws have been found, because that's the way you go back and ask more and more questions. And I don't know what Fiona said. I just think never give up. You don't give up. You just don't know what's around the corner. We didn't know Brexit, COVID and the marina modelling were all going to work in our favour once the licence had been granted. And I would do it again. If I felt strongly enough about it, I would. But we had a celebratory drinks party the weekend after, and one of the fishermen came for a drink, and he said, I've got another project for you girls. And he told it to us, and I just went, nah. I don't know what Fiona thought. Nah. I thought,
no.
It's got to really strike a chord. I think it's really got to strike a chord. You've got to be passionate about it.
Well, his cause did strike a chord, but I think we need to still maintain our focus.
Yeah.
And as I said earlier, we were the pointy end of it all. It's not. We were talking to some people sometimes, at midnight. We'd be doing weekend work because that's when professionals were available. We were working all the time. It was pretty full on. But yes, I would do this again. It would be nice if we could have been able to spread it a bit with other people. People were very keen to offer us advice. Oh, crikey, but to actually come and help, no. I mean, you brief someone on doing a leaflet distribution and they go, oh, I didn't realise it'd be that many houses, and they just wouldn't do it. I mean, little things like that. Never mind the bulkier stuff. But we did have some help at the beginning, and as I said, the professionals have been marvellous. And yeah, I'd do it again.
I mean, the trouble is getting more people. You need to get people in at the beginning and keep them, because halfway down the line, it's really hard to explain to them simply what is going on. And, Fiona and I had the innate background knowledge. And we did. I remember getting a girl here, and she came in and sat down, and I said, right, this is what's going on. And after about 10 minutes, she just glazed over, and then I never heard from her again. And there's just so many different aspects to it. And it was, if you've grown up with it, you know what it is. But if you're trying to explain it to somebody else, so for other campaigners, get the professionals in, get your group to start with, and keep them. Keeping them is really key, and then never giving up. And there was something else, I can't remember what it was. Never giving up, because you just don't know. And that's what everybody said to us. They admire our persistence, our doggedness, our determination. And that's why so many campaigns fail, I think. It's because people don't realise how much hard work it is, and do give up. And then, the big boys win then.
And I think that's probably a good point to end on. A thought for the day. Joanna Thompson, Fiona Punter of the Save Our Sands campaign, thank you very much for talking to the Watching Brief this afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. That was great.
A watching brief is a formal programme of observation and investigation to record and report on notable discoveries on an archaeological site. As part of our ongoing watching brief, Andy and I work hard to bring you the best, the worst, and sometimes the more quirky happenings from the world of archaeology. We aim to provide a space where voices can be heard, opinions shared, and sometimes truth spoken to power. If you believe in the work we do, please consider supporting us on Patreon for as little as $1 per month. Thank you. So there we have it. A pretty good interview, I think. It was quite lengthy, but I think we did the right thing letting it breathe and have that hour and a bit of time, because actually there was a lot to be said. After all, this is a campaign that's been going on for as long, more or less, as we've been doing Watching Brief together. But for me, it was really useful to put names to faces and voices and the people behind the Save Our Sands campaign. So well done in that sense to you. And also, actually, I say that because also when we weren't recording, it was actually pointed out that Andy's coverage was an early encourager for the campaign. The fact that they knew that they were being noticed in what they were doing. So the pipeline gets an extra sort of little gold tick for that. But
blue tick these days.
A blue tick, yeah.
And you don't have to pay for it.
But more to the point, I feel as though actually, especially towards the end of that interview, there was a few really key points to take away that I think heritage colleagues, archaeologists, museum specialists, the interested public could really reflect on. Not least the need to have a bit of staying power, a bit of conviction, because there will be hurdles put in your way, or perhaps a judicial review that doesn't necessarily seemingly go the way you want it to, small things like that. But if it's a cause that's genuinely got merit and is righteous in that sense, sticking at it is not easy, but it may well be the right thing to do. So it was interesting to get that overarching sense of the Save Our Sands campaign.
Yeah, look, I think one of the key things to take away from all of that is, well, first of all, it's unusual for us on Watching Brief to be able to look at a story in terms of a beginning, a middle, and an end. Or at least an end so far. There may, as was alluded to at the end of the interview, there may well be a sequel coming down the tracks at some point. If somebody else comes after that large amount of industrial aggregate that's sitting off the East Kent coast. But in this case, personally, and as Watching Brief, we have followed it almost from the beginning of the work of the Save Our Sounds campaign. I think it's worth saying that among the very trenchant criticism you heard there of organisations like the Marine Management Organisation, to a lesser extent Historic England, but also the Port of Dover and other parties involved, the consultants involved, in particular Royal Haskonians, who are acting for the Port of Dover, they would say that under the current planning rules, they behaved entirely properly. They fulfilled their obligations, and that when something was found to be inadequate, they made amendments, and it was all to the in the name of quotes sustainable development. Now, I think the key question really for the colleagues that you've just mentioned in your introduction there are if that was acting entirely properly and appropriately, there's something wrong with the system, because ultimately there were 6.5 years of finding that the application by the Port of Dover was inadequate. And there were, and again, as Joe and Fiona said in the interview, there were still outstanding questions. For example, most pertinently, the full archaeological scheme of investigation hadn't been properly interrogated, peer reviewed, and agreed. So even when the license was dropped, and there may well be other reasons, including faulty wave modelling, as was suggested again in the interview. But I think one of the reasons for opposing the license, had it been applied for again, would have been the archaeology, that the scheme for archaeology was not seen as adequate. And it would have delayed the scheme even longer.
Yeah, and obviously recently we've covered the Dorman Long Tower, Tees Valley fiasco that again happened within existing planning rules, and yet we are still, even despite what we said last week in terms of there being a slight hiatus in terms of risk to archaeology, we actually are still, as you pointed out last week, facing a potential sunsetting of environmental protections based in EU law. That threat is still very much there. So it's good. I mean, I don't want to end on a downer. This has been a real victory for this campaign. I suppose my only question would be, and this is a hypothetical, where would the line be for accepting the merits of apparently a sustainable project? They were selling it as being sustainable, the various people who were interested in seeing the development go ahead, and yes. it was you could argue being slightly greenwashed. It depends, at different times. Certainly, it was being given a veneer.
Undoubtedly so.
Yeah,
undoubtedly so. Yeah.
But if a campaign genuinely, or if a building project or a development project genuinely had actual green credentials, really was the best scenario for the environment, at what point do you think campaigners should accept that some of this stuff should happen at different times in different places? I semi-jokingly said to you a couple of weeks ago, well, the problem is if you put a spade in the ground almost anywhere on the British Isles, you're going to find something, or you can make a case for something, even if it's just a landscape case, a visual case. There must be a point at which that this discussion has to have give and take, presumably.
I think absolutely. I mean, it's often said that archaeologists are not against development, and as a profession, archaeology isn't.
No,
a very large part of the profession, certainly in Britain, is involved in developer-funded work and is predicated. If the developers suddenly if the developer funding suddenly wasn't there, a lot of archaeological jobs wouldn't be there either.
No.
So there is this symbiotic relationship. Some people on the right might say this parasitic relationship where this unnecessary body is attached to development, and that's where the problem lies. I think that what we've seen here is, first of all, a tenacious campaign by people who really believed in their cause. And you talked about righteous causes earlier. It was in that the scheme as written was found to be, under current rules, inadequate. Now, it didn't have to have been inadequate. Port of Dover made all sorts of decisions. Their consultants made all sorts of decisions about what to submit and how and so on, which meant that it was inadequate. And they were quite rightly called out on it. And and that's why we've ended up where we are. We're seeing a very similar thing play out in the case of the A303 at Stonehenge, where there's a long-standing campaign saying that in that case it's been found to be unlawful. Dover wasn't found to be unlawful. It's come to an end for other reasons. Stonehenge, we're waiting. It was sent back to the government saying the decision had been procured unlawfully to go ahead with the A303 at Stonehenge, and we're waiting a new decision, and whether that will get judicially reviewed as well. So
crucially, it sounds like, I mean, you say they believed, but it wasn't just belief, was it? I mean, actually, in the interview, it was quite clear, and they made it clear that actually you have to have good science experts, actual evidence. You can't just say,
precisely,
we don't want this.
And I think that's the key point that lies behind why I think we need to do that interview, actually. And the discussion that it has to prompt, really, in the profession is how many times has a planning decision been made on the basis of evidence that was inadequate, not fit for purpose, didn't cover all the bases, and particularly the ones that would have been inconvenient to the client? I think anybody who follows planning applications, and I've been involved in a number in a private capacity recently. One in particular, a consultant's report had all the hallmarks of having been done on the cheap, intending to deliver a positive decision for the client. There is an old saying that dates back to the early days of computing, which is G.I.G.O, G.I.G.O, garbage in, garbage out. And that is how the planning system actually works. If the data, if the reports, if the consultant's analysis that goes into the planning system is not adequate, chances are the decision making will be poor as well. As Fiona and Joe made the point in the interview. The Marine Management Organisation doesn't have its own panel of experts on tap. It relies on the data that it's fed by the consultants on the one side, the applicant on the one side, and if there's opposition, by the people opposing the plan on the other. And that is meant to facilitate a better decision making. Now, what we heard there, I think, is actually quite disturbing, but it's also reflected in the planning situation on land as well. And I'm thinking particularly of high profile projects like, for example, the A303 at Stonehenge, where the argument is that the information that is being inputted by licensed applicants isn't adequate or isn't the whole story. And that instead of giving rounded information so that a planning authority has all the information at its fingertips, there is a tendency, perhaps an unconscious bias, perhaps in some instances, it can be alleged there's a conscious bias, that consultants who are being paid by a client feel they need to deliver for the client and not for the wider environment and the wider community. And it's an accusation one hears leveled from time to time, even by some archaeologists working within the planning system, And I think it's something that something a as high profile a decision as the Goodwin Sands license, which eventually, to coin the phrase, ran into the sand because Dover ran out of time and there were still questions being asked, suggests that maybe there are problems with the system.
Well, I mean, we mentioned at the beginning of this recording that it's the Football World Cup is on, and a crucial part of that is that you play the ball, not the man. In that sense, you don't or the woman, or the person, you don't break their legs. You actually play the game, and in this instance, what we saw was Dover arguably playing, certainly the women, making accusations.
Certainly earlier on in the campaign, that's true.
Yeah.
Yes, it got quite personal.
But also, I mean, you mentioned Stonehenge. I think an awful lot of the conversation surrounding that tends to drift into personality. It tends to drift into opinion as opposed to, again, playing the ball. And I suppose I find myself wondering what.
Well, for example, we've had criticism from some archaeologists involved, and particularly in the pro Tunnel A303 upgrade side, saying, for example, that somebody like Dan Snow shouldn't be making videos about Stonehenge because he's not an archaeologist.
Yeah.
And that is gatekeeping. And as we've seen in the case of the Goodwins, Joe and Fiona are the first to say they're not archaeologists, but like the Stonehenge people, they've talked to expert archaeologists. Dan Snow's a history journalist and tends, if he doesn't have a particular handle on something, talks to people who are experts. You might not always agree with his point of view or what he does, but it's perfectly legitimate.
I mean, to be fair, in that sense, if Dan Snow can't make a video about Stonehenge, Tony Robinson can just F off, can't he? Because he's definitely,
exactly.
You know what I mean? But and to make it clear, I don't agree with that. That's the whole point. But
no, neither of us do. No.
But the question that it draws out of me, the question that I find myself inevitably asking on that notion of how are we actually seeing this planning versus progress or whatever, planning versus change and protection sort of triangle play out. And this analogy of a ball game is, what role actually should archaeologists be playing in that? Should we be kicking the ball around at all in that sense, or should we be refereeing? Should we be providing the pitch upon which the argument is played out? I think this raises big question marks for our colleagues, and as you say, also question marks if people aren't doing their best to find neutral ground and be the making the case for the environment that they want to protect. Why, I suppose, and that's certainly a question that came out of the subtext, I think, of the interview, and also off camera with the Save Our Sands campaign was this, and also you've had conversations with people around Stonehenge where people are asking, what are you doing? What are archaeologists actually up to here? And it's interesting that the public doesn't always know in that sense.
And quite deliberately so. We heard about that strange, consultation meeting that took place on a weekday afternoon when everyone's at work not in the centre of Sandwich or Deal or Dover, but in a industrial park off, out in the boondocks. And so, look, I think cut to chase. Like I said, everybody involved, certainly on the Port Dover side, will have said they were behaving entirely properly. But I think the question has to be asked. I've been asked by councillors in planning meetings, well, if you don't find this particular proposal acceptable, what would you say is acceptable? And my response to that is, it's not my job to say that. It's your job as the regulator, as the decision-making body, as the planning authority. What my job is to point out where there are failures in what you are being presented with. And that's not being that's not being anti-development. It's being pro-development done properly and pro the law. And I think that has to be the bottom line for archaeologists.
Yeah. Well, folks, that's been a watching brief. I'm looking forward to seeing what you guys think of it. Please do comment below. Please do share. And what do you think about this balance between development, protection, and and the law in that sense, planning process. At the end of the week, as I alluded to at the beginning, we're going to be talking about Nottingham Castle, and it sounds like Loki, Andy's dog, is eager for a walk. So I'll let Andy head off. But yeah, until then, guys, do take care. Bye bye.
Bye bye.